You're tuned into the Spot-Up Pod, the official podcast of the Spot-Up Shot newsletter. I'm your host, Paul Garcia. In today's episode, the Spurs went 2-2 in their last 4 games, diving into how the Spurs have relied on their defense as they weather the storm on offense in their last 8 games. Some players who would fit with the Spurs are reportedly off of the trade block, and then previewing the upcoming games for this week. All right, welcome back to another episode of the Spot-Up Pod. It's been about a week since I last recorded an episode, and the Spurs went through 2 straight back-to-back sets here. Let's dive into the last 4 games. All right, so let's go back to Tuesday. The Spurs are on the road at Memphis. The Spurs were favored by 5.5 points in this game. The Spurs led early by 11 points, but then really the Grizzlies came back and made it a ball game where it was close for the remainder of the night. In crunch time, Cam Spencer came through with 2 clutch shots for Memphis to help the Grizzlies defeat the Spurs by 1 point in that narrow win for Memphis. It was a defensive game for both teams, with the offense really struggling for both sides. When looking at the math game, the Grizzlies won the 3-point line by 12 points. The Spurs did win the twos and free throw line by a combined 11 points, but overall it wasn't enough by just one that the Grizzlies won. And then the Spurs did struggle again from 3 in that game, shooting just 30% from outside. Regarding who was in and out of the game, the Spurs were again without Devin Vassell as he's on the injured list. Victor Wembanyama came off the bench in a minutes restriction. And then the Grizzlies were also without multiple rotation players. The top 3 players from this game, it was Cam Spencer ends up with 21 points, 8 rebounds, 8 assists for Memphis, starting in place of John Morant, who was on the injured list. Wemby, again, in his role off the bench, comes up with 30 points and 5 rebounds, also a block in just 21 minutes. And then Julian Champagnie had a strong game for San Antonio in the starting lineup with 23 points, goes 5 of 8 from outside, and adds 8 rebounds as well. So now let's go to Wednesday. The Spurs are traveling home back to San Antonio to host the Los Angeles Lakers on the second night of a back-to-back. The Spurs were favored, though, by 8.5 points. That both teams were on the second night of a back-to-back. This was a close game in the first half, but then the Spurs really gained some room from the Lakers in the second half, and they ended up pulling away in the fourth, winning by as many as 16 points. The Spurs had their best defensive game of the season in this contest, holding the Lakers to just 91 points, a season low for an opponent. The Spurs, again, were without Devin Vassell. Wemby came off the bench on a minutes restriction, and then the Lakers, though, were missing several key players as well. They were missing LeBron James, Austin Reeves, and Rui Hachimura. In the math game, the Spurs did win the 2-point battle by 22 points and the free throw line by 9 points, which was enough to comfortably win against the Lakers by 16 because the Lakers did win the 3-point line by 15. But again, it wasn't a big enough issue for the Spurs on this night. The Spurs, though, did shoot a season low 16% from 3-point land, but the Lakers weren't much better themselves, shooting just 23% from outside as well. The top 3 players in this game, it was Luka Doncic carrying the Lakers with 38 points, 10 rebounds, and 10 assists. Keldon Johnson had a very, very good night for the Spurs off the bench, matching a season high of 27 points on a very efficient shooting night, 11 of 13 from the floor, also added 6 rebounds. I wrote about Keldon, just looked at some tape from him in this game, but then also looked at his 6th Man of the Year candidacy. At that time, after this game, he was 3rd in the Vegas odds. And so I think that if the Spurs end up with a top 5 record out west, Keldon has a very, very good shot at winning 6th Man of the Year this year, as long as he keeps up the production that he has. Again, visit that piece over on the spotupshot.com. And then Stephon Castle had a strong game with 15 points, 5 rebounds, 4 assists, and 2 steals as well for San Antonio. All right, now let's go to the weekend games. So on Saturday, the Spurs are on the road at Boston playing the Celtics for the first time this season. Both teams were top 5 teams in each of their conferences. So the Spurs were a narrow 1.5 point favorite over the Celtics in this game. I do want to note that the Celtics were on the second night of a back-to-back. So basically, this is like I said, 2 top 5 teams in their conferences. It was a close battle throughout, almost very, very defensive type of game. Both offenses were struggling, but the Spurs, again, relied on their defense, held the Celtics to 95 points in this contest, and they got the win in crunch time by 5 points. Wemby comes up with 2 key clutch mid-range jumpers, first going to his right over Neemias Queta on a mid-range jumper. Then on the final jumper for him, he ends up going left against Baylor Shireman and makes that shot. And then also on defense, Julian Champagnie comes through with a clutch block on Derek White on a late 3-point attempt. So the Spurs, again, hold on to win in Boston by 5 points. Regarding the lineup, Devin Vassell was still out for this game. Wemby came off the bench on a minutes restriction. And then, of course, we know the Celtics have been without Jason Tatum this entire season. In terms of the math game, the Spurs won the 2-point battle by 12 and the free throw line battle by 11 to overcome Boston's plus 18 advantage from the 3-point line. The Spurs, again, struggled from outside, shooting 23% from distance. The Celtics, though, set a new Spurs opponent season low, making just 3 free throws in the game. And they only got there for 4 attempts. And that's because, again, they shoot a lot of jumpers. And so the Spurs had a very good night on defense. The top 3 players from this game, former Spur Derek White ends up with 29 points, 9 rebounds, and 2 blocks and 2 steals to lead the Celtics. De'Aaron Fox ends up having a good night here with 21 points, 9 rebounds, 6 assists, shooting 8 of 10 on twos in this game. Again, his 3-point shot has not been there, as I've talked about and written about lately, but his 2-point shot has been pretty decent here. Shoots 8 of 10 on this night. And then Wemby, again, off the bench, ends up with 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 blocks for San Antonio. Then this is usually my theme. I think last time it wasn't, though, because the Spurs are at least coming off of that off a win last time. But anyway, the Spurs, it's my turn to record a podcast, and sure enough, they're coming off a loss in their most recent game. This just recently happened. So let's talk about the Wolves game on Sunday. It's the second night of a back-to-back for both teams. The Wolves were favored by 2.5, and I want to say that because it's actually it's not common this season that the Spurs are ever underdogs. They've been favored in a lot of their games so far this season. This was the first time the Spurs were underdogs since way back on Christmas against OKC. So the Spurs kicked off this game very well, starting the game off with a 16-0 run to begin the game. They led by 19 points twice in this game. But then the Wolves did come back in the fourth quarter. They ended up winning the fourth quarter 33-18. Let's go to what happens in the final few possessions at crunch time. 34 seconds left. Anthony Edwards gets Victor on a switch. Edwards said, at postgame that he didn't want to go to a jump shot because, he knew that the chances are very high that Wemby would end up blocking his jump shot. So he's able to go to his right and get by Victor. Then he uses a screen from Julius Randle to kind of get some space away from Wemby. He ends up getting enough room to take a 3-foot floater with Luke Kornet coming in, and he gets that floater to go in off the glass to put the Wolves up now. With 17 seconds left. Then with 17 seconds, the Spurs have 3 chances to try to win this game, and they couldn't do it. So first, they start off going to the mid-range again with Victor. He ends up going to that foul line mid-range area, goes right against Julius Randle, who is he's not much taller than Baylor Shireman, but he has more size, so it's harder for physically Victor to push Randle out of the way and get space away from him like he did against Shireman. And so Wemby ends up missing that mid-range jumper. Then Luke Kornet has a chance at a tip-in. He ends up missing that one with Rudy Gobert right there under the rim. And then finally, Julian Champagnie ends up with the second offensive rebound, kicks it out to De'Aaron Fox at the top of the arc with 2 seconds left. 2 Wolves defenders closing out on Fox. He ends up missing the shot. It clanks back on the backside of the rim. And, that's been the theme for Fox lately, is just he's having a tough time making his 3-point shots as of late, even though his mid-range jumpers have been pretty decent. And so the Spurs do end up losing that game on the road in Minnesota. There in crunch time, I think it was by 1 point. Again, even though I know the Spurs struggled in the fourth, allowing 33 points, mainly because of their turnover issue in the fourth, they had a very good defensive game again against the Wolves. Regarding the rotation, there was no Devin Vassell out due to injury, and then Wemby did make his way back into the starting lineup for this contest. He was back in the starting lineup, though he was still on a minutes restriction, still played under 30 minutes. In terms of the math game, the Spurs won the free throw line by 8 points. That was their biggest advantage, and they finally won the 3-point line by just 1 shot. But the Wolves had enough in the scoring department of the twos, winning that area by 12, and they had a big advantage in the paint to overcome, barely win by 1 point. As far as who the top 3 players were in this game, it was Wemby with 29 points and 7 rebounds. Dante DiVincenzo for the Wolves with 19 points, 9 rebounds, 7 assists, shot 5 of 12 from 3. And then Naz Reid off the bench with 17 points and 11 rebounds for the Wolves. And I do want to say that Naz is one of those players that Keldon is competing with for that 6th Man of the Year award at the end of the season. So looking at that week for the Spurs, Vegas said they should have gone 3-1. They ended up going 2-2 this past week. So, in terms of looking at, who was favored in underdogs, they kind of underwhelmed a little bit. Although this was a very tough slate of games against, except for Memphis, good teams, the Lakers, the Celtics, the Wolves, all teams with 600 or better records. And so, as far as my prediction, I thought they would go 2-2. I thought that they would beat Memphis and the Lakers, but then I thought they'd lose to Boston and Minnesota. They reversed that in terms of the Celtics and Grizzlies games. So again, they ended up going 2-2. where the Spurs now through 39 games as of Monday afternoon, they are 27-12, still hold the second best record in the Eastern Conference. They have though just a 1-game lead over the Denver Nuggets, who are actually playing pretty well despite losing a lot of their key starters, including Nikola Jokic. And they're still on pace, the Spurs right now, for a season where they might win anywhere from like 52 to 56 wins according to the different projection models. Now, because they played some very good teams, they played Minnesota, they played and the Celtics and the Lakers in this past week. Those are all teams who are very, very good teams in their conferences. Where I wanted to update the Spurs' record when they play 600 and above teams, because again, these are the kind of teams they're going to see in the playoffs. And so the Spurs still have a very good record against some of these more elite teams in the league. They're 10-5 against 600 and above teams. Their only losses, those 5 losses, coming to Minnesota, who they've lost to twice. The Phoenix Suns have a record at 600 and above, so the Spurs are 0-2 against them. And then, of course, the Spurs only had 1 loss very early in the season to the Los Angeles Lakers. So again, the Spurs against these very good teams in the league, even despite right now that they're going through this really tough stretch offensively, they're at least still holding up. And could come out 2-1 against the Wolves, Lakers, and Celtics is a good outcome considering the current state of the team right now when they're really struggling on offense. All right, so I've spent a lot of time lately, whether it's on the podcast, my whole episode last week was a lot about the Spurs' struggles on offense, specifically shooting the ball. I also wrote a big piece over on thespotupshot.com looking at more in depth at their shooting struggles as of late, and really that hasn't changed too much. I know they shot a little better versus Minnesota. They shot 34%, but again, that's still not great. But it's at least a sign that the offense looked a little bit better in terms of shooting the ball. So what I want to talk about right now is how the Spurs, even though yes, they're going through a very tough stretch offensively in their last 8 games, basically since Christmas, where they are 4-4, they're at least relying on their defense to keep them in these ball games and squeak out some of these wins. So let's first just go through some extra numbers that I've dug up on offense. So again, these are in the last 8 games. So basically post that Christmas game in OKC. They rank right now 27th in offense on the last 8. Before, during the first 30 games, they were 5th best. They had the 5th best offense. It's obviously a lot of it has to do with their shooting. No matter what 3-point data you want to look at, whether it's just their general 3-point shooting, their wide open threes, their open threes, they're just struggling from shooting the 3-ball basically, in a lot of those different metrics. And if you're watching this on video, I will display these numbers over on the screen. Now, what's happening though, the impact of that, or the effect, is that teams are willing to now shrink the paint even more to make those driving lanes for De'Aaron Fox, for Stephon Castle, for Dylan Harper way more congested. They're seeing a lot of double teams or multiple bodies there in the paint, and so it's becoming harder to make those passes out of the paint or even find those open shooters, or take it in terms of them getting their own shots. They're having trouble finishing at the closest area to the rim, having to rely on a lot more of those floater range type of shots, which are more inefficient shots. And so that's another impact, is that you're seeing the Spurs' interior scoring in terms of their efficiency there near the rim. It's really struggling. Even with somebody like Wemby, you're seeing him finish a lot of his shots, more so from the mid-range or that short mid-range area. A lot of the players really aren't getting as close to the rim as they had been doing before they started having these 3-point shooting struggles. I recently wrote about the 3-point shooting slump over on thespotupshot.com this past week. And so, I gave different reasons in that piece about why I think it's happening. Some of the factors I looked into were, the fatigue just catching up to them, having all those games in December on the road, including going to Vegas for the in-season tournament. Also how you just put a lot more effort into those Vegas games because those are almost like playoff level atmosphere games. Just several different factors that I looked to. I also talked about how Devin Vassell, one of their high volume 3-point shooters, has been out of the lineup as of late. Then I looked at a player-by-player analysis of the players taking threes, and who have been struggling lately. And I talked about some players who I think can get out of it eventually because they have a history in their game of eventually, getting back to going through some slumps and then getting back out of it. So one of those players I think will eventually snap out of it is Harrison Barnes, because the guy's a 38% career 3-point shooter. We know that right now he is in a slump, but maybe that game against Minnesota, when he shot a lot better from outside, including one in the fourth quarter, got to go in. Maybe that's a sign that Barnes is finally on his way out of this shooting slump. So again, someone like Harrison Barnes, I trust enough in the data with him having a long career of being a good outside shooter that he's eventually going to get out of this slump. However, someone like De'Aaron Fox, I'm really interested to see how he gets through this slump right now. So for the season, he's shooting 32% from beyond the arc. Earlier this season, he was at 39%, just really shooting, having a career year from 3. And so this latest slump has really impacted him. And so for someone like Fox, it's iffy because, his career average is only 33% from outside, and he's only had 2 or 3 seasons where he shot, better than like 36% overall. So again, I'm not sure if he'll ever get back to that 39% number that he was at, those first 30 games to start the season. So someone like Fox is a question to watch. I think he's going to shoot better than what he's been shooting as of late, but again, he may not get back to where he started the year. And then they have those young guards. They're low volume shooters, players like Stephon Castle and Dylan Harper. We know that hasn't been a strong part of their game, but even they are both in more of a shooting slump than they're usually in. And so, we'll see, just how much they can improve. 2 players who are shooting very well right now from 3 are Julian Champagnie and Keldon Johnson. We know that Julian's, starting in place of Vassell. And then Vassell's absence really shows because the Spurs, one, need another high volume shooter, but then someone who shoots very well. And so that is Vassell on the team. So eventually when he comes back, he should help as well with the 3-point shooting slump. Regarding their bigs, Wemby, of course, he's actually shooting kind of close to his average. So Victor's not too concerning with his 3-point volume or accuracy. And then Luke Cornett doesn't take any threes, which allows the help defender or the big to kind of drop back and, protect the paint even more again, clog those lanes for Fox, Harper, and Stephon Castle. So again, I think that some of these players, they'll eventually get out of this shooting slump, but I don't know if the team's ever going to get back to where they were in the first 30 games of shooting at least, over 36% from 3. I don't know if maybe that was just an early season indicator where maybe they were just shooting really well, and maybe now they may fall to like 34, 35% whenever the numbers get back up just a little bit. But as I mentioned, as the Spurs have been going through this shooting slump or these offensive struggles, the one thing they've been able to rely on to get some of these wins to go 4-4 in their last 8 games is their defense. I mean, their defense is really popping right now in these last 8 games right now. Just looking at some of the numbers, they have the second best defense during these last 8 games. They're before the 30-game mark, they were the 5th best defense. A lot of highlights for them on defense. Opponents were struggling to score against them from 2 and 3. When you combine the effective field goal percentage, opponents really struggle to get to the foul line. As I noted against the Celtics, they're not giving up a lot of offensive rebounds. I know there's select games where they look like they're really struggling on the offensive glass, and those are very select opponents. But overall, they have the best opponent offensive rebound percentage in the league. And then opponents struggle to get second chance points. One thing we've really seen with having Wemby and Cornett there now, whether Victor starting or coming off the bench, or Luke starting or coming off the bench, and then they play some French vanilla lineups as well, is that opponents really aren't making a lot of shots or getting a lot of shots near the rim right at that closest point, where the Spurs have moved from 12th at the 30-game mark of the season to 3rd in opponent makes from that restricted area. The accuracy has gone down a little bit though, but again the attempts have really dropped. And so just a lot of different numbers here pointing to the defense, really excelling right now in these last 8 games, which has helped them navigate through these struggles on offense right now. I will note that one of the areas to watch though is that the 3-point attempts, the volume of the opponents has gone up, and so have the makes, but the accuracy hasn't. It's kind of been where it's been at for most of the season. So again, that's just kind of something to watch, and I think that's a lot of Wemby and Cornett being on the floor, because now those 2 players like to play a lot of drop defense to protect the paint, and so maybe that's why opponents are seeing more of those arc 3 opportunities against the Spurs' defense. So yeah, basically, what the Spurs are in these grinded out kind of games lately, really struggling, these physical kind of games. And so what they're doing is they're making their opponent kind of get into these kind of ball games with them. And so basically it's just about, who ends up excelling there in crunch time at the end of the night. The only 3 games where they really kind of struggled on defense were against the Jazz, the New York Knicks, and the Blazers. But other than that, these other 5 games on defense, they've really been excelling. All right, for our third topic, let's go through some news and notes. Let's first begin with 2 players who had their contracts guaranteed. That was Bismack Biyombo and Lindy Waters III. They were both on non-guaranteed deals up until Saturday, January 10th. And now that date has passed, which means both players will receive their contracts fully guaranteed at $2.3 million, where they'll have a veteran minimum cap hit on the Spurs' books. The Spurs do have a full roster with 15 players on standard contracts and 3 players on two-way contracts, and they are also $13.7 million under the hard cap. So what this means for the trade deadline that's approaching on February 5th here is that if the Spurs make a move, they have to make sure that the move is either like player for player, where they're not taking additional players than the amount of spots they have open, because they don't have any open spots right now, or they would need to waive someone first before bringing in extra players if they don't have enough roster space. Also, regarding trades, they can never cross that hard first apron hard cap, where again right now at the moment they are $13.7 million under that hard cap. So if they execute a trade, they have to make sure that they never cross that first apron hard cap line. So right now, through 39 games, my opinion, and I'm working on a piece right now where I'm looking at some players who would be good trade fits for the Spurs as I did last season. But right now, I do think that maybe they'll look at like an extra shooter, more of a rotation player off the bench, as a safety player in case, someone else goes through more of a shooting slump. I don't think they're going to be aggressive at this moment for, a high volume shooter or someone, with the big contract, just because of, where they're at right now, second in the West. But I will say, if this shooting slump continues, again, it's been 8 games now. If we get to like 15 games, in a week or two, and they're still struggling, bottom of the league in 3-point shooting, and still multiple players are struggling, then I do think that they might have to start looking at pursuing someone, who's more of a high volume shooter, but maybe someone who's in the starting lineup. And so, I'm putting a piece together, looking at some trade fit pieces for the Spurs. But again, right now, I think that they'll just kind of look at some players off the bench, kind of to target right now. But if they continue to struggle from 3, I think that that's going to definitely be something they have to be more aggressive in pursuing. Speaking of the trade deadline, I'm also working on a piece regarding, Jeremy Sochan's status with the team, with the trade deadline approaching, because obviously we know that for most of the season, Sochan has been out of the rotation, and we know that he has a chance to be a restricted free agent this coming off season. The Spurs didn't extend him back in October. So again, maybe he looks like a player who could be a trade candidate for the Spurs. And so again, I am working on a piece about Sochan, but I want to mention that he did get some minutes in the lineup recently where the Spurs really needed defense, against the Memphis Grizzlies. So he got a lot of minutes there, really helped change the tone of the game with his defense. And then he also got some minutes on defense against the Lakers, not so much against the Celtics and the Wolves, but again, Sochan's kind of seen his got some minutes. And again, for his trade value, that would help for other teams to see him out on the floor, see what he can do defensively. And obviously he showed in that game against the Grizzlies that he's still very capable of being one of the better on-ball defenders. And 2 players who were going to be on my trade list for the Spurs, who I thought would be excellent fits for San Antonio, as I've written about over the last several seasons over on the spotofshot.com, are Trey Murphy III and Herb Jones. But this past week, Chris Haynes of Amazon Prime reported that the Pelicans are informing interested teams that Zion Williamson, Trey Murphy III, Herb Jones, Derek Queen, and Jeremiah Fears will all remain with the team past the February 5th trade deadline. So basically, even though there was some reporting that teams were allowed to call and ask about Murphy and Jones, earlier in the season, now it looks like, according to Haynes at least, that the Pelicans are telling teams no, those players, they're not going to move them. And so again, the Spurs reportedly had interest in Murphy before the season began. There was a report that came out, and I had written about that over on the spotofshot.com. Obviously, I thought he'd be an excellent fit for the Spurs, especially what they need right now. But again, right now, as of what am I recording this? January 12th, it looks like the stance for the Pelicans is that they are not going to trade Murphy or Jones or any of the other 3 players I mentioned. But we'll see. Maybe their stance changes. There's still 3 weeks until the deadline, and we'll see. But for these front offices, they're having to now deal with Joe Dumars, who's running the Pelicans front office, and so he's back in the front office role after running the league, working in the league office for a number of years. So again, maybe Dumars is more set in his expectation or his marker here that he's not going to trade these players, and he's gonna maybe let them finish out the season, and maybe, who knows, maybe look to move some of them in the offseason. So for right now, Trey Murphy III and Herb Jones are reportedly off the trade block. Let's keep going. All right, so before we close out this episode, let's preview the 3 games this week for the Spurs. They only have 3 contests after going through 3 sets of back-to-backs to open the month of January. So let's first talk about, I'm going to look at the last 8 for these teams, how they're doing. So the Spurs in the last 8, like I said earlier, they're 27th on offense, second best defense. They are 4-4. On Tuesday, they travel on the road to Oklahoma City, where they will play the Thunder for the 4th time this season. The Spurs are 3-0 so far against the Thunder. The Thunder in the last 8 games have the 10th ranked offense and 5th best defense. They are 6-2. So this one, I know the Spurs have won every single contest so far against OKC. I'm going to say that because of where the Spurs are at right now on offense, with how much they're really struggling, I'm going to say that OKC wins this one, just because, again, right now at the moment, I don't trust the Spurs' shooting. In 2 of those 3 contests against the Thunder, the Spurs were shooting very well from 3. Now they're not. And then also, just how much the Spurs' guards have been struggling. You don't know what kind of night De'Aaron Fox is going to have. He could have a really good game, or he could have another off night like he did against Minnesota. The 2 guards, Stephon Castle and Dylan Harper, have both been struggling as well, especially Harper. And so, I just don't know. Based on how the Spurs are playing, I'm going to go ahead and say OKC wins that game. I'm probably going to be wrong because, again, the Spurs are 3-0 against the Thunder, and that they seem to have the Thunder's number, but we'll see. Then on Thursday, the Spurs are back home hosting the Milwaukee Bucks for the first time this season. The Bucks have the 6th best offense in the last 8 games. They have the 17th ranked defense, though, in that stretch. They are 5-3. I'm going to go and say the Spurs win because I think that they can make it an ugly kind of ball game with their defense. And also Wemby just goes to another level against Giannis Antetokounmpo in those kind of matchups. So again, I'm going to say the Spurs win, plus they're at home. Then on Saturday, the Spurs host the Minnesota Timberwolves for the first time in San Antonio, and the Spurs are, of course, 0-2 already against the Wolves. The Wolves in their last 8 games, have the 3rd best offense and 9th ranked defense, but as we saw on Sunday, I think the Spurs can make that an ugly ball game for the Wolves on offense. And so I'm going to say that the Spurs win this one because it's back. The game is now in San Antonio. And again, I think that the Spurs can, their defense can be there to make the Wolves struggle on offense enough. And plus San Antonio's, the game's in San Antonio. So I'm going to say the Spurs go 2-1 this coming week. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode of Spotted Pod. If you like what you heard, please subscribe and leave us a rating on your favorite podcast apps and our YouTube channel. The Spotted Pod is recorded and produced by Paul Garcia. The music for this episode was written by Vincent Garcia and Paul Garcia. Thank you for listening and have a great day.